G'day, my name's Nurchin, and today we're looking at a cryptid that is truly terrifying because it not only lives in the world of reality, but also mythology. It's the Wendigo! The Wendigo is a creature from Native American folklore and mythology. It can be found in the northern forests of Nova Scotia, the east coast of Canada, and the Greater Lakes region. Now, depending on where you hear about it, it could be called the Wendigo, the Witico, or the Windigo, or names along that kind of line. Now, with these differences, you also had slight differences in description, and some were quite simple to some being completely different, especially depending on the culture. Now, this can make it a little bit difficult to nail down. What a lot of people think of these main two forms, this kind of traditional idea, and then maybe a more bastardized or more kind of Western version of the Wendigo. But each different type was important for their own reason, so we'll kind of break them up into different segments. Now, the first one I'll talk about is what most would consider the traditional Wendigo, which I'll refer to as the creature. This creature is what can be considered the traditional Wendigo. It was a symbol of imbalance, once human, overcome by some kind of insatiable greed. Now, it was iconic for its cannibalistic tendencies, and that was primarily how somebody could become a Wendigo. Now, there's a few different reasons or theories as to how you'd become one, but a staple is that if you ate human flesh, especially on sacred land, you would become one of these creatures. Overcome by this curse that would make you just insatiably hungry, forever looking for your next meal. It was kind of like an old school boogeyman, trying to warn people away from these immoral activities. Now, if you're really hungry and you're thinking, I could just eat a bit of human flesh, you know? That dead dude over there is looking pretty... Well, that morals are one reason you wouldn't do that, but another reason could be, well, if I eat that man, I'm going to be cursed for eternity. You know, kind of like a moral compass in the form of a terrifying creature. Now, my art style tends to be a touch cartoonish, so I don't think I could really do the creature justice. So I reached out to a friend of mine. You can find him on Instagram under Aidan Cleary Art, and I sent him nothing but a passage from a scholar called Basil H. Johnson, and the passage reads like this. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash grey of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets, the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton, recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from suppurations of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odour of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. Terrifying. Now, just from that description alone, you might start to compare the Wendigo to the Western zombie, the rotting flesh, the hunger for humans, but back then there was kind of a different reverence for the dead, and with it came much more supernatural elements. And the Wendigo itself, depending on where you heard about it, had some supernatural powers. Some of these powers included shapeshifting or voice mimicry. It would apparently hide just outside of town and use a human voice to call for help, trying to lure people out so it could kill them or turn them into a Wendigo. Help, help! Boom, dead. Or boom, Wendigo. Maybe both. It's just that spooky. Now, that may all sound well and scary, but you may be thinking, that doesn't sound like the Wendigo I grew to know and love. Well, that brings us to this next interpretation of the Wendigo, that I'll simply label as the Beast. Some tales of the Wendigo say it would grow in size equal to that of what it just ate. So it would eat more and more, grow larger and larger, and never be full, which leads back into that kind of never-ending hunger part of the curse. Now, it would supposedly keep eating, growing larger and larger until it even surpassed the treetops. Now, this is starting to sound a whole lot less about the more humanoid cannibal form of the Wendigo we just talked about, and it goes even further than that. Some stories say it was covered in hair or even had a full fur coat somewhat like a yeti. Some of these stories also said it had horns or antlers, and a lot of them also said it didn't. See, this is kind of a contentious part about the Wendigo. We're not entirely sure when people started applying a deer skull and antlers to the Wendigo. Now, it definitely appears to be from Western influence that this started, but it may have just been a mistaken identity with the Skinwalker, another Native American piece of folklore, something I'll definitely have to get into another time, but easily recognizable from the deer skull. Overall, it doesn't really matter what the head looks like, it always acts the same and it's always called the Wendigo. But that's also why this is so sad. Here you have this piece of Native American culture that goes back centuries, and then another culture comes along and goes, "Ooh, that's quite cool, I might take that, and I'll give it a deer skull and horns, and I'll make it look cool and spooky." This is straight up cultural appropriation, and it's kind of sad to think that now this is what people think of when they hear the Wendigo, and I'll admit, I'm kind of guilty of that myself. Come on, Telltale. You gonna show me this thing, telling me it's the Jersey Devil? I know a Wendigo when I see one. Yes, that clip is aged like warm milk. But in a way, this is still kind of a Wendigo. Okay, hear me out. The point of the Wendigo was never the creature, it was more about the idea, fear and imbalance. Well, when the Westerners heard about it, they feared nature. They feared this kind of unknown part of this culture they didn't understand. Now, the traditional Wendigo was terrifying to the native people, and just as this one was terrifying to the Westerners. In a way, that is their Wendigo. It's kind of confusing, so I'll hopefully try and tie it all together with this next part, which I've labeled the spirit. Maybe not a great way to kind of classify it, but hopefully it kind of makes sense by the end. The Wendigo was a force of nature. I said it would appear during winter. Well, in a way, it was kind of like a metaphor for winter, kind of like the White Walkers from Game of Thrones. If you remember that early description as well, it had grey skin and tattered lips, kind of like somebody seriously suffering from frostbite. Well, in this last part, you'll see parts of the cannibal and the beast in how it affected the Native American people. With the change in the weather, so came the Wendigo. It would pick a town or a village and lay them to siege, killing all the animals in the area to starve them out and slowly making it unbearably cold. Then the Wendigo would sit just outside town and play with the minds of the inhabitants. It would start pushing thoughts about insanity and cannibalism, slowly making them more and more paranoid. And it also had its supernatural tricks like voice mimicry, or this one ability to make people feel like their skin was burning, so they'd rip their clothes off and run out into the snow where it could kill them. Now, the paranoia starts to set in, and think about it, this is where the Wendigo is genuinely terrifying. You start to think, what if I become a Wendigo and kill someone I care about? What if my neighbor turns into a Wendigo and kills me? Or what if there's a Wendigo just outside my house? What if I kill my neighbor first, before he turns into a Wendigo? And this is where this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy appears, which they later called Wendigo psychosis. There's an iconic and morbid story from 1878, where a trapper from Alberta butchered and ate his wife and 5 kids, only 25 miles away from emergency rations, supposedly overcome by this Wendigo psychosis. Now, this was in 1878, where they didn't exactly have the best facilities or ways to diagnose mental sickness. And since then, psychology has completely panned any use of Wendigo psychosis. But it is interesting to see that back then, rather than treating this mental sickness as a human condition, it was just regarded an effect of this supernatural being. Back then, the Wendigo was kind of a real thing, and you can understand why defining what a Wendigo is can start to become confusing. Now, this is from looking at the Wendigo in retrospect, and there are some other interesting theories that have come up since as well. One, that the Wendigo may have just been the white man, and honestly, it makes sense. The Native Americans lived in harmony with nature. You couldn't overfish or overhunt, or else you would feel the negative effects of that. And then come cultures from the West, where it's more about owning more and taking more, and back then, yeah, they were pretty bloodthirsty. If you think back on it, it makes perfect sense, even down to the white skin that we heard about the Wendigo, the greed and the slaughter. Not a very flattering depiction, but it definitely makes sense. So we have the Wendigo with all these different interpretations across multiple cultures, And then it has another big hit within literature, a short story called Wendigo, written by Algernon Blackwood, later even inspired H.P. Lovecraft within the Cthulhu mythos. Another thing I have to get into another time. And the cultural appearances and references don't end there. The Wendigo appears in Pet Sematary, a classic, as well as a character from the Marvel Comics, has films like Wendigo, Ravenous, and The Last Winter, TV appearances like Supernatural, Grimm, Hannibal, Sleepy Hollow, and X-Files, and even video games like World of Warcraft, Shin Megami Tensei, and Until Dawn. And if you're wondering why I'm referencing all this stuff, it's because do you know how hard it is to research this creature? One of the top search results is kill a Wendigo while wearing a clown costume? Thanks, Todd Howard. So, you may be wondering, does the Wendigo exist? Well, yes. And no. It kind of just depends on what you think a Wendigo is. Now, is it a giant creature walking amongst the treetops of the Canadian forest with a deer skull for a head? Probably not. We probably would have seen it by now. But if you think a Wendigo is just a human that's been overcome by greed or cannibalism, well, in a way, that has kind of existed. And I'm afraid, even as far as the supernatural elements go, that's about as close as we'll ever get to a definite answer. It's not very satisfying, but you know, them's the works. The video is over, and yes, I am back. It's been 3 months. Consider it a magical journey. Now, I'm back making videos, but if I ever do disappear again, I implore you to follow my social medias. I've got Twitter, Instagram, or even hop in the Discord. And speaking of which, I want to give a shout out to some channels that have been awesome friends of mine over the past few months while I've been gone. You've got Netwinder, Jack Alpha System, Phil Dogs, and of course Nehru. The links are in the description down below, be sure to go and check them out. Rumour has it, I even appear in some of the videos. Yeah, nice. And as always, be sure to smash that like and subscribe, and if you don't, I might just go insane and eat your flesh. Bye.